Hey y'all, it's your captain for all things creative coming at you today to talk to you about the Michael movie and the way it made me feel. So if you're new to this channel, welcome. Thank you so much for, trying out this video, and please like, share, and subscribe. If you're returning, thank you so much for rocking with us. Now let's first get into the non-spoiler review, then my top 3 takeaways, which are spoiler filled, and then end with how I would remake the movie. So non-spoiler review, as much as I can, would be to say that this movie is a lot of fun. It's a trip down memory lane for people who were there while, the greatness was being birthed. Also, for those who don't know much about Michael, it does show a lot of things that are helpful to know. And really, if you're looking also for themes about family, because it's very much Jackson 5 heavy, since it's about, the beginning of Michael's life and the beginning of his career as a solo artist. You will really, really enjoy the themes of family and nostalgia of it all. So that's the non-spoiler review as best as I can do. Now let's get into the spoilers and like my top 3 takeaways. So when I look at this film through the spiritual lens that I have, and especially as an educator, there's a lot of themes that make it enjoyable for me. Now, I was entertained. I wouldn't say I was completely satisfied, because I don't think 2 hours is enough for a movie like this and an artist like Michael. Like, his spirit and his legacy cannot be contained in just 2 hours. And also, even in spite of, some of the allegations and a lot of like the tabloid headlines about him, like saying he had like the elephant man bones and all that stuff, and even with some of the extortion attempts that have happened, Michael Jackson, he has been exonerated, in terms of the court cases that he has fought. And I do feel as if it's still important, if the film wanted to show his full life, for them to explore kind of, the allegations and like the court cases that he had. And at the end of the day, I think it's a big problem in our society for us to sanitize, our heroes and our greats, because everyone has flaws. Nobody is perfect. And I think it's important to figure out, what harm some people have done, as well as the good, because the good is obvious, for a lot of people, and that's like the public facing thing. But I think in Michael's case, the movie shows a lot of the secret good that he did, in terms of, him funding hospitals and visiting, sick children privately. And a lot of the slander attempts and the extortion attempts were very loud, especially like in the 90s, when there was that attempt to really bring him down. But at the end of the day, I think that Michael definitely deserves a legacy. And even, people like Nicki Minaj and, our problematic face, quote unquote, as flawed as they might be, they do still deserve a legacy, especially if the overall good that they've done, is significant, even as we do need to pay attention to their flaws, right? So getting into the movie, I do think that the top 3 messages that I got would be, 1, the double-edged nature of family. The second most important, I guess, message would be the phases of spirituality in Michael's life and how they all helped him, grow and change and become like a great artist on his own. And the most important message that I'll talk about last would be the humanization of Joe Jackson as a parent, reacting to Michael's giftedness and possible neurodivergence, which the film does really, really, really subtle and artful ways of exploring and showing that. So let's talk about family. It's like the baseline thing. So it's important for all people, and especially for, famous families like the Jacksons, to have a family and a support network and a base, especially, when you start having money and fame. And Joe Jackson has a line where he warns Michael, he's like, you don't want to end up, being at a phase in life where you have all this money and just people around you that only tell you yes. Because in a lot of ways, that's a lot of people's downfall. When you have yes men and nobody to, hold you accountable or even help you if you're, doing things that are self destructive, it's so important to have a village. And I think for Michael and the Michael movie, it showed just how much his family nurtured him, even with his father just discovering his and his brother's talent. But I think that's also a growing edge in the film. That's why, it's not getting the praise from a lot of the fans, and it has like a low Rotten Tomato score by some because they leave out a lot of his songs, especially the women. Whereas Janet, especially, because at the end of the day, if you want to go with the narrative, right, that Michael was the only one pouring into his family at one point. He's the one that, is the reason for all their wealth, and he's the only star, and he has all the clout. That would be false because a lot of his siblings, were successful in their own right, especially Janet. And when we get to the allegations and all the trials and tribulations that he had in the 90s, it was Janet Jackson's fame and star power that helped, bring him out of that slump that he was in when they made the video Scream. And I remember when that came out, I was a kid and I always loved anime. So when that video came out and they had like the little anime type animations and you saw them two dancing, I was like, oh my gosh, they're so cool. This family is so talented. Like, so to not have Janet, even if, she herself didn't agree to be in the film, they could have at least shown, the mom pregnant with her in 66 or whatever, because Michael was born in 1958, so it goes through when he was 8 and he was to lie and tell people he was 10. So by the time, the movie's in full swing, they could have at least shown, the mom pregnant with Janet and mentioned, oh, we about to have a little sister, something, because to not have Janet at all, that is insane, especially because for Michael's life, as much as, he really, raised the star of his family, there was a point where Janet was the one that, again, raised Michael's profile and helped him get out of a slump with the media, So family, it was important, but they didn't do it the best that they could, even though you did see, how much family was important to Michael, especially when he felt kind of ostracized or needed a break from society. He would go back home and eat ice cream with his mom and watch movies with his mom. Those scenes were always great. But at the end of the day, it did kind of come across as when Michael got famous, his family became kind of moochish and dependent on him, and he saved them, and that tour was like their second lifeline, and then he was a star all on his own, when in reality, again, Janet especially was just as big a star and actually helped him out of a slump, later in the 90s. So next point, spirituality. I really think the film did a very good job at alluding to and kind of beautifully showing how spirituality worked in Michael's life, and I think in a lot of people's life, because at first you have the mother kind of being the main source of his spirituality and like the lessons about how to depend on God, because they're Jehovah's Witnesses. So there's like a clear line where Nia Long, who's Michael's mom in the movie, is telling him about Jehovah, and he is just a child, so at this point he's mainly, relying on his animals and his mom, but you see his mom instilling, the belief in God and, the Jehovah Witness values in particular. And I think for many people, we start off, with our parents and like our upbringing being the foundation of our faith, but then you see Michael Jackson kind of navigate his own ego-driven spirituality when he's, rebuilding himself after, going through all the abuse from his father and the fame. So when he's navigating his journey, to become a man, an artist in his own right. One of the main tools that Michael uses as a way, to tap into a spiritual power and growth are mantras, right? And one key scene where they show this is when he's in the studio about to record Thriller, and before he starts singing, you can hear him saying words of affirmation to himself. He's like, I'm strong, I am confident, I'm the greatest. That was just so powerful, because the self-talk, I'm telling you, as somebody, who was in ministry and who, does mentoring, that self-talk, that way that you speak life into yourself is so important. Also, you see him writing down his visions and not being shy about letting his team know the vision too, and telling them exactly what outcomes he wants. Being shy and shirking, that's not going to help you when you're trying to make your dreams come true and trying to improve yourself. So he names what he wants, and like Jesus says, you have not because you ask not. And Michael Jackson definitely demanded of himself and of his team the level of success that, led him to be the greatest of all time so far. And one of the last ways you see him kind of explore spirituality, like that middle phase of spirituality in the movie, is when you see him going in nature to connect with God. And it's done most dramatically and comically, when he's sunbathing in the swimming pool, saying that he wanted to get ideas from God before God gave them to Prince, which made me cackle because Prince is another one of my spiritual and musical faves. And that rivalry between them was alluded to in a nice way there. So again, the mantras, the self-talk, the power of life and death being in the tongue. And Michael Jackson showing that, chef's kiss, right? And then the last phase of his spirituality, which is seen in the movies, when, Michael has his kind of road to Damascus moment where he is forced by his dad to do this Pepsi endorsement. And we all know that very tragic, part of Michael's life. But I think in the movie, that's where I connected to the character the most, because I think Jafar Jackson did a really, really good job portraying the impending doom of it all. I really felt that scene. I think that's the best scene of Jafar's acting in the whole movie. And again, the spiritual power of that arc of the movie was very profound, because again, at first you have Michael being taught about spirituality by his mom. Then you see him doing his own type of spirituality again with his mantras and whatnot. But then he has that moment where literally God catches that wig on fire. And I would like to think that that's only a freak accident, but back then, I'm telling you, the black hair care process was trying to kill us. Like the Jerry curl juice, the synthetic braid wig. I have been at commencements where I've seen girls' hair catch a fire. It wasn't a joke. So when they showed it in the movie, it was acted out so perfectly. And at the end of the day, Michael gets out of the ego driven kind of spirituality to getting that mantle and that, I think, prophetic leaning to heal the world and make it a better place, because he's in a hospital bed. And I really think they did this well, where he was talking to his bodyguard, which was also very beautiful, because I didn't know how much of a closeness and a bond that him and that bodyguard had. I've seen the letters and stuff now after the fact, but when he was telling the bodyguard, I believe the guy's name was Bill, how he knows that God saved his life, because he could have died, but now that he's saved, he knows that he's got to make the world a better place. And he donates the settlement money to the hospital, which was 7 figures back then, which was a lot back then and even now. So again, the spiritual journey, it was very beautifully done, I must say, as a spiritual girly. So last but not least, my absolute favorite way that I'm going to geek out about a little bit, that, the film stands out as a very, very important contribution, to the legacy that is Michael Jackson, is through the way they humanized Joe Jackson and Michael a little more through the lens of Joe kind of noticing and the directors alluding to Michael's greatness that you see coming with neurodivergence. So at the end of the day, Joe Jackson 100% abused his children in some ways. And the extent of it, we don't know. Only that family knows, and I don't know. So allegedly, there was all manner of abuse being done to the kids. And there's even an interview where, someone was trying to ask Joe about it and like try to get him to be accountable, and basically told him that, Michael said that he was so scared of you, he would even vomit thinking about, all the abuse he went through. And his reaction to that, Joe Jackson's reaction was like, I didn't know he vomited, but even if he did vomit, he vomited all the way to the bank. It's just like that kind of reaction. And some past portrayals of Joe Jackson, you might think that he was kind of just like an abusive, money-hungry-ish, monster-ish kind of parent, and the worst kind of stage parent that, yes, maybe had good results, but no, did not use the best methods. But again, Coleman Domingo did an awesome job with Joe because he humanized him in a way that I haven't seen in a lot of other projects. And again, he clearly was seen, using a belt to discipline Michael when Michael kind of talked back to him about being tired after one performance when he also stood up for his brothers and said, no, we did a good job. And the father was like, you don't know more than me, bop, bop, bop. But at the end of the day, you still see a lot of moments of Joe clearly trying to love and understand his son through the best ways, I guess, that he knew how. And just like little looks. You'd have to watch the movie just for that alone, because at the end of the day, they made it clear that Joe knew that his son was different, not only because of the giftedness, but because of, again, the allusion to neurodivergence that we know that Joe Jackson did not have the language or tools for at that time in history. Because when we see the first practice, we see Joe Jackson struggling with Michael, trying to get him to make eye contact. And he does it multiple times in the film where he's like, look at me, Michael, make eye contact when you're performing. So that's like one of the first signs that Joe is noticing the neurodivergence, but again, not being able to name it. But he is able to coach Michael to a point where you see at a later performance, Michael's making great eye contact with girls in the audience. But again, that wouldn't happen without Joe. And you never see Joe beating Michael over the eye contact. So again, like I said, it's humanizing him through moments like that. And also there's moments like at the dinner table where LaToya says that Michael never eats. He's very picky about food. So again, they're alluding to the neurodivergence. And even when he's talking to his mom and saying he doesn't really connect with his peers. And you see that he prefers the company of animals and things of that nature, So again, this film does a good job of alluding to Michael's neurodivergence. And again, you see Joe, even when Michael's getting the animals, kind of looking at his son knowingly but not judgingly. So you see that there's a love there mixed with him not being able to understand what exactly is going on or how to deal with it, but still trying to work through it and pull the greatness out of his son. And that, it touched me as an educator. Like, it totally humanized Joe for me in a way that I felt more deeply, knowing, again, that the timeline and like the research and the tools that were available, because Michael was born in 1958 and Joe was born in 1928. And really the history of ASD scholarship in particular doesn't begin officially until 1943 with Leo Kanner's Autistic Disturbance of Affective Contact being published. And then by the time Michael's in the 50s and 60s, when Michael is a child and growing up, we had ASD being referred to as childhood schizophrenia, and it was mainly studied in white males in the suburbs. I said suburbs, sorry. And refrigerator moms were blamed. Now, an old trend in psychology is to blame parents and mothers for every psychological issue. But in the 50s and 60s, especially, psychological theorists said that mothers gave their children autism by being distant or lacking emotional warmth and being frigid, which would then cause children to retreat into themselves, which was clearly false and has been debunked for years. And in the film, you definitely see that Michael's mom was so warm and so loving, and Neil Long does a great job, of portraying this. And it's safe to say that Michael's mother's love probably saved his life, since he's been being exploited since he was a child, first by his father and then by the industry. At the end of the day, Joe Jackson wouldn't be alone in terms of, resorting to violence, we're not having other tools to kind of knock sense into children who, would have special needs. And I think even in the Caribbean, you see some parents, tending to use violence. They say those kids who can't hear must feel. And there are people who literally try to beat, neurodivergence out of their kids, or just hide them away in a room or an institution. So again, to see Joe Jackson as portrayed by Coleman Domingo trying to help his son in his own way, and knowing that his son is different and special, and finding ways to coach him to greatness at that time, again, when the research wasn't there and during the civil rights era, it's just very powerful to me. And I credit the actors and the filmmakers for making this aspect of the movie so powerful. Right, so now that I geeked out a bit about the movie and my favorite parts, here's where I'm going to put on my director's hat and say what I would do, to fix the movie. All right, so I put my director's hat on because we're fixing the Michael Jackson movie. First of all, to really fix this movie, I want Netflix or HBO to do a mini series. I need it to be at least 6 parts if you really want to make it a worthy tribute to Michael Jackson, because 2 hours, that's not enough, and we saw that. But at the end of the day, if you want to do the movie, this movie would just be part 1. I wouldn't call it Michael, I'd just call it Jackson. And I would cut down some of the redundant childhood scenes with the Jackson 5 that showed, I guess, some of the performances, because it was clear that Michael was talented, so you didn't really need to see him sing that many times, to be honest. Because, if you look at a movie like Bohemian Rhapsody, for example, the music was there, but it wasn't there in a way that sacrificed the storytelling in the way that it did with this Michael Jackson movie. So what I would do is I would cut out some of the redundant childhood performance scenes in order to add at least 2 to 5 minutes of showing Joe Jackson and his younger life in Arkansas. Either show him hungry, or maybe experiencing the strictness and abuse of his father, which is documented, and him vowing not to be hungry or not to be under anybody else's control again, right? And then continue the movie as it was, with showing Joe, being the driving force of organizing, the Jackson 5 and discovering Michael's talent. But then, like the movie showed, show how he was humbled over the years, by the fact that it was God-given talent that was bestowed upon Michael, and Michael had his own destiny apart from Joe, So the humbling of Joe Jackson, which I think was done very well in the movie, we could witness. But to complete the story arc, instead of it just ending in Michael Jackson's bad concert, I would cut to Joe watching the bad concert from like a TV somewhere where he's down bad, like have him be as gray and as bald headed as possible, and have him reiterate that line about, oh, that's my son, but instead maybe have him say it at first with pride, but then by the end when he says it again, let him say it with regret and a sense of apology and realization that this person was more than just, something I owned. So it's somebody that deserved my love more, like I think Coleman Domingo did an excellent job with Joe, but like having an end where Joe kind of acknowledges maybe what he had done and either, come to some kind of realization, that he's not, he's not God. He's not the one that even deserves control, because Michael, again, has his own spirit, his own soul, and really wrestle with that on screen. That would be a good end to that movie, because at the end of the day, I think Coleman Domingo gave the best performance of all as someone who loved his sons clearly. There were great moments, I think, that humanized him. You could tell that he was still an abuser, but at the end of the day, he was trying to understand his kids. Like, even those scenes where he was watching Michael Jackson buy the llama and whatnot, and even when he saw Michael not making eye contact and was encouraging him to make eye contact, just seeing that he wasn't a monster completely was well done. So I think the movie has something there. So yeah, folks, say how you felt about the movie in the comments if you saw it. And if you didn't see it, I recommend it, especially if you're a fan. You're going to have a good time. Maybe get dressed up. And no matter what you decide to do, remember you're the master of your fate and the captain of your soul. Bye.